Welcome to this workshop, which is brought to you from Sierra Leone by George Mansary, social worker, founder and chief executive of Ruth's Hope Kindergarten in the northwest part of Sierra Leone, a very rural coastal community where we are working on some sustainable development. My name is Chief Ya Bompopso Kunkbana III, and in 2018 I was made a chief in the Port Loko district, but you may also know me as Ruth Stark, social worker. George, in July 2020, made a significant statement at a World Conference around the reality that the Western models don't work here in this part of Africa, and that we have been working on and developing co-design and co-production within communities on community development using the indigenous structures and co-building change together. The kindergarten came about in about 2014, 2015, when one of the aftermaths of the war was reuniting children with their families. The devastation of war is that many families become split. In this case, family members found themselves in other countries surrounding Sierra Leone, and some of them found them on long refugee and asylum seeking routes into other countries and other continents. And if you're going to build a community, you need to start with what is local and where people want to be, and with their desire for rebuilding their lives. In Africa, there's a proverb, it takes a whole village to bring up a child. And it is with this philosophy that we start by recognizing that when you are reconstructing from such chaos and devastation, the importance of not just the family, but the community, the environment are absolutely critical to the well-being of bringing up children. So the kindergarten approach is to provide an environment of social structures and physical provision that nurtures the development of the next generation. And this is set against an environment of international aid and political instability, where short-term crisis-driven resourcing of sustainable development has been seen to be ineffective and results in community disillusionment. We're an organic community, not in the Western sense an NGO with structures and hierarchies. That doesn't work here. We work within that spirit and that relationship known as Ubuntu. I am because we are. We're interrelated, we're interconnected, we depend on each other, and we have a collective responsibility to look after each other. So our journey so far has included community meetings, meeting with other groups, meeting with other people in other areas of the world where there have also been these periods where one has to reconstruct after disaster. And the picture in the middle here is from Nakivale, refugee settlement in Uganda, meeting with young men from many different countries who are living in the oldest refugee camp in Africa. We have some guiding principles that we've worked out on our journey. We want to achieve equity. We want to respect the richness of diversity. We want eco-social balance in our world for sustainability. and we want investment in our shared futures. And we also recognise that with self-determination, which we all recognise as an important part of respecting each other, we also recognise there are consequences. So we take this quote from Ezra Taft Benson: "You are free to choose, but you are not free to alter the consequences of your decisions." And some of this workshop will be about the consequences of some of the decisions that each of us have made in terms of self-determination. We also recognise that there is an important issue for all of us to address in terms of global social justice. One of the issues between the global north, the global south, and what's happened to fuel some of the crises that we now face is the centuries of international exploitation of ores, minerals, and people, taking from one country to build the wealth of another. And it is this global justice that we are focusing our attention on. How can we help this happen? We also know from our experience that people all over the world would recognize this statement. People do not want to live with violence or war. If it's violence in the home, if it's violence in communities or between countries. And we've just listed some of them in this slide here. What we would say is there are some that we need to focus on some of the consequences for people in our communities a result of the actions of states. Because whilst we might be able to do something about the violence within our local communities, because that's where we're immediately living and involved, between states, there's less influence and control that we as individuals can do. So we think that there's a real role for communities in terms of and how we work with communities and in communities to shape our futures. And one of the things about wars is the displacing of people. And if you observe what has happened over, say, the last 20 years, we have seen many waves of refugees across the world, whether it's in Latin America moving up to North America, whether it's Africa, Middle East moving to Europe, whether it's Asia moving to Australia. We have seen waves of refugees, and the geopolitical kind of answers that states have to these issues tends to be driven by the immediate crisis of that particular wave, rather than realizing that this is something that needs much longer term commitment to helping people cope with some of the changes that are being made in our world that forces people to move from their homelands. And sadly, the long-term prospect is that many will not return to their homeland without significant investment in rebuilding infrastructure, not only in buildings, but in social communities. The communities are our first organic system of social support that build harmony and bring peace to our communities. Let's go back to Nakivale in Uganda. Here we have generations of displaced people living in a refugee settlement, and there are many around the world, in Jordan, for example, and on the borders in neighbouring countries. What happens in these refugee camps is that new communities are built within another country than the country that the people come from. And in building these new communities, they create work and local economic systems, health systems, schools, training centres, and it's almost like one world within another. But the people who live in the camps do not have citizens' rights, but they are contributing to the care of the planet just as anybody else does. And they are concerned with recycling the rubbish that we all put around the environment. And they are developing their own organic social reconstruction. And many are still fearful to return to their own homelands because there is no stability in the places that they come from and no peace. They remain in the shadows and on the margins of civil society. So we're bringing from Sierra Leone our experience of rebuilding better, if we can. And it is 20 years since the end of civil war in Sierra Leone, and we are still working with the aftermath. But our planet and the sustainability of our planet tells us that time is now a critical factor in sustainability. And so we need to think about how we are going to change some of our own behaviours so that we can work together to create that new eco-social world. And one of the problems we are facing is this us and them scenario that has operated for many years now in terms of funding sustainable development. Applications for sustainable investment from the poorest people to the richest people globally are time-consuming. And the number of forms, the number of hurdles and barriers we go through in order to try and get some money to do something that is absolutely critical, a critical point in a rebuilding program, is extraordinary. The bureaucracy and the decision making is extremely poor. As I've said, with climate change and the instability in geopolitics, we need practical as well as principled change to the way that we go about building a balanced eco-social world for our shared futures. We start, I think, by recognizing that local problems occur in the context of global problems. And so we need to work in tandem between local and global solutions. But there is at present an enormous policy and practice experience chasm between what works locally and what is being driven globally. So let's look at how we arrived at the global drivers. We began working on a new model of globalized governance through the League of Nations after the First World War and the formation of the UN after the Second World War. The UN came about because the League of Nations didn't work. And it had two main aims: to maintain international peace and security, and to develop friendly relations among nations on the basis of equality and the principle of self-determination. So what did they do? It was an agenda set by states and implemented by states, and a high-level decision-making. Yet war, poverty, inequality persist. Let's take, for example, some of the decisions that have been made at that geopolitical level and about the level of international cooperation in reconstruction. After the Second World War, we had the Marshall Plan, which helped the development in Asia Pacific, of recovery from war, and in Europe, funded by North America. And that Marshall Plan was effective because everybody had an agreed interest in it. Because if world markets were restored after the devastation, we would have a working economy again. But let's look at what happened in Afghanistan, where for political reasons, there's been little or no Western international investment in the last year. And that has placed particularly women and girls at a huge disadvantage, undoing many of the reforms that were made over the last 20 years. Why? Well, that's for us to think about in the course of this workshop. How we change that is perhaps more important. And now we have Ukraine. What's going to happen there? How is that going to be rebuilt? There have been millions of refugees dispersed around Europe and in other continents now. And how do we evaluate the equity in the current global government arrangements when we have seen what has happened to Afghan, Syrian, Somali, other refugees from other conflicts, and some of the instruments of deportation, refusal to support people taken by wealthy countries. These are all serious issues for us to consider. It's not helped particularly by the top-driven approach in supporting people, which is based on philanthropy, charity, NGO funds, or international government-sponsored aid. And we say that because we believe that there's been a real flaw in these systems in how decision-making takes place. If you take some of the literature around this, you understand that a lot of the value systems that drive the fund holders in terms of the big foundations or the international charities, there's quite a lot of bias in some of the ways and the judgments that people make about how their money will be spent. And we have been revisiting decisions that reflect the deserving and the undeserving poor. And we have that also when we think about, well, how some of the situations have arisen and the arguments about whether it's a just or an unjust war, and who is the beneficiary and who is the oppressor. Is war justified at any point? That's another question. But the top-driven approach is very much based on we, the funders, know best. This top-down approach fails to deliver an end to poverty because it does not involve communities and people in that decision-making about investment in social development. It fails to recognise that dignity and respect of all people is important for our shared futures. We would like you to consider 2 new rights to recognise in going forward in our plans for the future. The right not to need to beg and the right not to be left behind. And moving on from the individual experience of people needing to beg in order to survive within our communities, we move on to the community experience about these top-driven policies and funding arrangements. And our knowledge from practice experience shows that the current funding of sustainable development is in local communities is haphazard and a lottery that leaves many people behind. And this has undermined community trust, essential for harmony in many parts of the world if we are all to live in peace, which, as you will recall, is one of the main elements of the work that we do as social workers and in social development, is to help create peace so that people do not experience the outcomes of violence. And we've recognised that in our communities in Sierra Leone, a really important part of how we have been rebuilding after the Civil War is the organic community development. And Indigenous knowledge tells us, without doubt, that there is a richness of knowledge developed over millennia of social protection and sustainability, which has grown up through local communities with expert knowledge of those communities and of the environment in which they live and of the earth on which we all depend. And this is talked about in Africa in terms of Ubuntu, interdependence with each other and with the sky, the sea, the water, the land. So can we weave this huge richness of knowledge into our co-design and co-building for our joint futures? And some of it is already happening in a kind of an organic way, because people will recognise that when there's been a catastrophe, people move away and there are diasporas around the world of different communities. From that community, going back to their roots, there is often a diaspora of community support and well-wishing and the rest of it. So we have not only the formal state, NGOs, international aid, we have the communities that are still remaining where they are, but we also have the support of the diaspora, the community diaspora that is global. And here's an example of a hotel I stayed in Sierra Leone, which was being supported through social enterprise from Sierra Leonean people living in Europe. And I think that we together collectively, it gives an example of what we can do in different situations. And we contrast that with the absence of co-design and co-building and how it results in haphazard consequences in siloed thinking development that have failed to help contribute to sustainability. This is a picture of a schoolyard, which in our area, and you will see that the young people have got cell phones powered by portable solar panels, and this is probably the nearest they will get to owning an electronic device like a computer. There's no infrastructure of solar panels for the community, but there are these portable ones which have been acquired and are very expensive to run in order to keep people communicated, and that's people's communication with the outside world. And I didn't mention earlier, but the reason that George is not presenting this as I am is because of the lack of infrastructure and the expense of the internet services in his part of Africa, and that technically it is really difficult often to make communication because there are electricity blackouts in the city. There is the cost of getting anywhere of fuel or commodities that have to be imported is phenomenal. And all of these things build up to some of the difficulties of having no infrastructure in the community. And the water well they're sitting on doesn't work. Stopped working because the aid agency that put the water well in did not train local people to maintain the water well, and it has stopped working. So that's lack of holistic thinking. It's lack of thinking about how to sustain the kind of investment that we want to see happening in places like this part of the Bullum community. And what are the consequences? If you don't have clean, fresh water, it increases the possibility of life-threatening waterborne disease, of which there are many in this part of Africa. And when we don't listen to what communities see as being the priorities for development, people get angry, frustrated, and they take to the streets. So we start the cycle again of protest movements, riots, and civil war. We could do so many things to stop that cycle coming round time after time after time. I want to return to the second slide where we said that Western models don't work here, because it also raised a question about whether Western models work in the West. And I think that one of the big learning curves I've been on in this journey is to really question whether some of the assumptions of the rich global North are really defensible in terms of sustainability. So in this reciprocal learning, we all have a lot to learn about how we can take things forward and how we can do things differently. And working together requires us to create space to listen and trust each other, and to recognize the importance of human relationships. But it also requires us to listen to what other people have got to say about our world outside our immediate comfort zone of our professions, our communities, where we would normally operate, our families, and so on. And I certainly feel that in the last few years, I have returned to some of my earlier educational roots and looking at economics, philanthropy, charity, looking at how people make decisions about money, how they make decisions about what they consider to be just. And in revisiting some of that, we can learn so much together about what we can bridge between each other to co-build and co-design our futures. And these books describe and explore factors in decision making made by funders of social developments. And I was referring there to the one by Angus Deaton and the one by Paul Vallely, and how at that global level, that international governance level these things are developed. But I also want us to think at the same time, so it's multitasking, about some of the things that we have already done in the process of coming up to this summit. And one of them is about 6 actions we can do together to co-build a sustainable and fair world. Because I've mentioned looking at economics as being a really important part of what we might need to do in terms of co-building change. This involves thinking about our environment, moving from exploitation to sustainable coexistence, thinking about the governance structures we have between nationalism and globalism, about the role of trade, business, and about how we have fair trade in our world, about the conditions that people work in, and about revisiting what is state responsibility, what is community responsibility, and what is individual responsibility. And these are very many issues that we need to consider. So let us go back to where we are in terms of what happens currently in terms of the Western model of funding sustainable development, or social development, should I say. And the task for some of us is to put in bids for funding projects to attract investment or gifts from wealthy individuals, or foundations, organizations, and governments. And this is a task that requires us to think about who is the funder, because we want to engage them in this process so that they will give us the money that we can get on and do this work we have to do within the community. So we have to think who the funder is and how they exercise their judgment about how they will spend their money. And anybody experienced in applying for funds knows full well that it is critically important to understand the motives of the funder, to get the right messages about this particular project to the right person so that you can get the resource. And then you have to evaluate it all, because if you can evaluate it and show you've been really successful, hey ho, you can get back some more, you can get back in there and get some more money. So there's a kind of a process that goes on that we really do need to go and think about very, very carefully. So when we spend money, any of us, we're looking for best value. And we think about, are we saving something? What are we spending it on? What goes in taxes? What goes under the mattress? Yeah, these are things that all go in how we make decisions about spending our money. But what happens when others spend our money for us? And do we trust them to do it wisely? And that's where governments and electorates and all of these other things come into play. So how we make decisions in this area when we're talking about spending money is complex. It's both objective and subjective. It's not just based on facts and figures, but each of our lived experience and how it has shaped our lives. So individuals, funders, or people who are running these funds, some of their personal experience will impinge on that decision making. And some of it might be because they themselves have experienced poverty. Or maybe they've never experienced poverty. Have they experienced abusive relationships that have affected capacity to trust? Or have they been through that moment of sisu, a Finnish term, which says you go through a frontier from being a victim to again having the confidence and the strength to contribute to development and change. So you move from being victim to being a contributor. What's going on for our funders? What have they had that leads them in this direction. And whilst many recognise the reciprocity of economic and social health for individual and collective well-being, funding decisions in social development appear to be made on individual projects, parts of problems to be developed and evaluated, rather than as a living, multidimensional organism. So this organisational methodology results in silo decision-making in response to complex matrices of interconnected problems. This is not how we make decisions in our own lives. So why should we be making it in terms of our shared responsibility with each other and social development? Can we take the strengths of systems at all levels and from different models to make a more equitable model for resourcing social development? Can we rethink the episodic cycle of wars and economic policies? Let us take, for example, the theory that the economic stimulus of building weapons of destruction is important to dealing with economic problems domestically. We've seen that time and again being developed. And when you think about it, it's actually nonsensical. We create weapons of destruction, we then use them, we destroy our environment, we destroy cities, we destroy families, we destroy communities. Sometimes it's about sustaining power and control, but it also provides a stimulus for the next round of economic development. But why go through all this destruction when actually maybe it might be better for all of us and the planet that we work on concentrating on building peaceful communities that involve people, that involve displaced people in their communities, that create that trust and harmony. That counter-argument about wars fueling economic stimulus needs to be taken on its head, shaken, and thinking about how we can do this better in terms of sustainability of our planet and our people. And we contrast this with how indigenous cultures and communities make decisions about shared priorities and shared resources through the principles and relationships developed through Ubuntu, using assemblies and meetings. And probably there are different types of democracy, and we need to think about what is the most effective type of governance. Certainly some of our first past the post electoral systems, certainly some of our totalitarian regimes and other forms of governance, we really need to think about what are the most equitable shapes of determining and including everyone in making shared decisions about our shared futures. So in our community in Sierra Leone, we co-design and co-build our community plan. This is the village. We meet, we discuss what everybody's priorities are, and we shape the priorities together. And we take into account buildings, schools, agriculture, fishery, how people live together, the violence against women, the violence against children. We take these things. How do we deal with crime in our community? How do we deal with all of these other things that go on? We really have, there are other models than the predominant Western model of developing and co-building sustainable futures. So we believe in open discussion, in co-design, co-building, and joint action for sourcing and resourcing sustainable development. And we have our challenges. This is where we have problems with not having proper water supplies and disease from the waterborne diseases. We need to develop local skills and local technical skills and knowledge about maintaining solar panels, wells, health systems, amalgamating traditional medicine with Western medicine so we can get the best of all worlds, and building basic infrastructure like roads, like energy sources that help children study beyond nightfall at 6 o'clock in the evening, because there's no electricity for them to be able to read or to learn at that point. But let's not lose that storytelling, that communicating with each other, because that is vital to the harmony that we all wish to live within. So here are some of our partners that we've built with. The first picture is of Nakibali, and here we have the Innovation School, where they have formed a school within the refugee camp. The bottom picture is our fantastic census team of people from the disabled group within the community. And this group were designated by the community meeting to go around and collect information on the skills and assets of each community member. And they went around about 500 people in 2 weeks and collected all that information. And that formed a fundamental part of our plan. So nobody gets left out and nobody gets left behind. Everybody contributes to the sustainable development. And we publish our plans and bring people together to debate which of the priorities we're going to concentrate on next. And out of this, so this all went on 2019. And last year, we started building our first eco-social accessible resource centre, which was designated by the community as being what they wanted. It had to be disabled accessible. It provides schools, a health centre, a technical school, a faith room, sports facilities, community rooms, a backpackers hostel, kitchens and offices. And this is where we are beginning to build some infrastructure that the community wants to use in order to create a wonderful environment for the children to grow up in. So here we are beginning to build. All this is done with local resources. The labour is local, the bricks are made locally. We had one of our engineering students who came from the community, who's at university, helped to design some of the fabric for the building. And we have found international partners, and we're very grateful to the Swiss Association of Social Workers, who helped provide some of the materials, money for the materials that we couldn't provide locally, to our LATAM group, which comes from Colombia, Brazil, Chile, and so on. And they're helping us to source some, well, two things, helping us with some of the design features of our resource centre, but also helping us are working with us on how we can develop a new way to co-build sustainable development away from the traditional aid kind of model, which we have found just doesn't work for us in Sierra Leone. And we also have colleagues at Han University who are keen to send students who are studying international social work to learn from us about this new way of doing social development. And they have been very supportive in the discussions about how we develop this kind of work. And we hope to go on in increasing the number of people who can help us work on new models for the future. And I return to our LATAM group and Mario in Chile, who helped us with his technical expertise on septic tanks, which was a struggle we had in Sierra Leone because there is no infrastructure of drainage or plumbing or anything like that. But we want to be ecologically sound. We do not want to add to the destruction of the earth. And so we're very grateful to Mario for helping us with this design. And we were all set to go and get some money for all of this. And this is one of the current problems we have with the system of going cap in hand, begging to funders for particular resources. We cannot currently buy the septic tanks the resources to make the septic tanks that we need to do, because at the point we began looking to find partners for the non-local resources, that meant going to the funders. War broke out in Europe, and I know that many people joining this workshop will know that the funding streams have been pouring into Ukraine, quite rightly in the sense because, you know, this is a crisis of phenomenal proportion. But the unintended consequence is that it's diverted funding from supporting people who are trying to make sustainable development in the communities, and the funding's gone into the crisis. And this is one of the big problems that we now face in terms of sustainable development. We are competing with crisis-driven aid funding for sustainable development. So we're looking for a new legitimacy, and we propose a shared approach to our joint futures in funding sustainable development, in co-building a new eco-social world. And we're beginning to get there, because in the midst of all of this, the community made links with another community that was prepared to help support a really important part of our economic structure, which was farming. Here is the community celebrating with people who have offered and are working now with us to find better ways of sustaining our economy. And when you hear Guterres talking about the crisis we are going to have, the food crisis we are going to have globally, this is a really important way of trying to help us grow our own food. So we are very grateful that we have found people who understand what we want to do, which is work together to find solutions, not have solutions thrust upon us. And it's lovely to see that we may be on the verge of something else developing that we think is really important to how we think about funding sustainable development. So the community has provided 100 acres of arable swampland, and we have people helping us to develop better ways of making that land work for food production. So as we come to the end of this workshop, we've tried to share with you that we are on a joint journey. So we now invite you to join with us in sharing your ideas and your proposals and your thinking about how we can move from this top-down approach to sustainable development to one which works with local communities so that we can achieve equity, that recognises the dignity and respect of each and every one of us in co-building our new eco-social world. And we invite you to enter your reactions to this presentation in the chat or in emails to us, so that we can go from this summit into the next phase of development of funding sustainable development that involves everyone in the spirit of Ubuntu. Thank you.